Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So we're towards the end of bio here, and I know many people have been here since Monday, and so I really appreciate your coming and joining us for our final session for the digital health track at bio. My name is Beth Rogozinski. I'm with a digital health company called Therapies, and it's been my great honor this year to work on the digital health committee here at bio. In addition to what we're going to see today, we've had a number of amazing experts and really thought leaders that are pushing and driving the whole of digital health forward. And I know that in many of our sessions, we've had experts as well in the room. So I want to thank you all for being here with us today. It's my great pleasure today, and we've got a bit of a longer session here because we think that this topic is so very exciting for so many people. How many people here have tried VR? Oh, this is an advanced audience. All right, good. And so what we've got for you today is we're looking at AI-driven empathetic therapies, and leading the charge and taking over is Sanjeev Wadhwa. Sanjeev actually has a new company that he's founder and CEO of called Life Singularity. Sanjeev has a background at Ernst & Young where he was a partner running the life sciences division, digital health. He's got decades of experience in this area, and he's put together a panel of experts that are going to discuss with you all today where we're at currently with AI and virtual reality therapeutics and where we think that this is all going to go. So please join me in welcoming Sanjeev.
Thank you, Beth. We got too many technology pieces all connected here, so forgive us if you're awkward stance while we're trying to speak here. I decided after about 30 years in the life sciences, healthcare, biotech industry that we had spent a lot of time on drug technologies and biotech and not enough on factors that impact health in other ways. So we as a startup are focused on the context of health and then marrying that up with medical and drug technologies, and I'll get into that a little bit later. We believe that AI as a fundamental technology has to come to pharma, biotech, and healthcare industry. You'll see some examples from our panel, real life examples of where this is being applied. So when I picked this panel, I just didn't want it to be a strategy discussion. I wanted this to be an applied AI VR discussion. So anything you see here is actually been applied or being applied in clinical science, in research, and the technology is being developed. So without further ado, let me introduce my panelists who will kind of go into their background, and you see some of their brief introductions here. To my right, immediate right, is Walter Greenleaf. Walter is a neuroscientist, Chief Scientific Officer for Therapeutics, and also is part of the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. To his right is Chris Chen in the middle. Chris Chen is the Senior Director at HTC Vive, which is a VR technology company, for those of you who don't know. And you'll see amazing examples of how we can move beyond screens like this to room scale VR, and how technology companies are looking at healthcare. So an amazing perspective will be brought to bear from Chris's background. And then to his right is Dr. Skip Rizzo. Skip heads up the Medical Virtual Reality Lab at University of Southern California Institute of Creative Technologies, and has done tremendous amount of work in mental health. So diverse backgrounds, different experiences, all patient-related. This is all about patient centricity. And just as a point of process, we'll have the panel discussion towards the end as you get to see some of the real demos. You sort of see the stage set up here a little bit in terms of the tripod stands here, and Chris and Skip will actually be demoing the gear and how it works in realistic settings with patients, so you'll get to experience the technology yourselves. So in terms of just, starting this process and where AI becomes a foundational platform for creating patient experience. So if you think of VR as the experience part, underlying that, there has to be a capability to deliver and formulate that experience. And we as a startup, started to think about how do you go about doing something like this? And I use this example of a real patient here. This particular patient was a schizophrenic for 25 years and overcame it through use of some of these technologies in VR. But underlying his journey, as he went through the journey, I experienced through his friendship some of these comments, which I've outlined as to what he was going through, in terms of a mental anguish as he worked through this journey for him. He gave me some of this feedback as, I need technology to be empathetic. And if it doesn't understand me, if it's just telling me when to take my medication, it's not enough. It needs to sense my emotional state and tell me when I should be taking that medication. It should sense my psychosis onset and be able to tell me if my behaviors are wrong. So all the indications that Walter just walked you through, these 7-8 points tend to capture that as a patient state of mind. And one thing in particular always hits me when I talk about this story is when in one of the discussions, this patient actually wouldn't leave his room for many days, stayed in his room, never left the room, never called anybody. And there are a lot of emotional triggers around, they don't call anybody, they don't pick up the phone for days. If they pick up, they don't talk much. Whatever they do say, it's very clumsy. The sentences are very clumsy. There's not a pure communicative, verbiage to what they're talking about. But that, okay, I could live with that as long as they're in sort of the safety of their home. This individual actually would walk out at 2 a.m., sit in their car, and just drive around the neighborhood with their eyes closed. Because the suicidal emotion, the onset was already there. And so I tell you this story because, the words of empathy, cooperation with the technology, helping me with the societal connection. Societal connection seems to be the biggest thing these patients want. And how can we connect? Can I connect? Can somebody reach out to me? Can they be my mentor? Can they be my coach? Is there a platform where I can experience and just talk about what I'm going through without, a medication being prescribed to me? So I set this context of, where part of our jobs as innovators is to see where the world has been. And I've spent 32 years in this industry only to realize we can count the cures on our hands. And I would go as far as to say, if we have to disrupt what we do, our methods are not working. They're working in some ways, but they're really not working. So what can we do different? And so if I was to, ask a question, what if we could run 1 million N-of-1 trials, or experiments as I call them? I mean, they're not driven by drug. What if the software was the drug and the physician was a virtual avatar? What if I could get that virtual therapy in a different way rather than it has to be a drug every time? We're trying to launch a couple of trials in India. So Life Singularity is a platform. We have aggregated about 100 million patient records. And we started with data because everything has to be built on that foundation. Otherwise you can't achieve some of these discussions. But our driving factor was a third question. And based on this patient's emotional state, which was, could I actually predict and prevent rather than detect and treat? And our industry is based on detect and treat. It's too far down. It's too far down their patient journey, for me to intervene and say, well, take these antidepressants or take this and that, and you'll get better. Even with cognitive behavioral therapies, we have done good, but we haven't hit the ball out of the park. So we took a step back and we said, well, what can we do with AI? And then what could be different that we could bring to the equation? So if I was to think of the context of our industry, I would say that's the innermost circle that you see on this diagram. So I have the genome approach, I have the drug-based approach, I have a biomarker, a molecular marker approach. And that's where we have started because that's what we could measure. And we're still trying to measure genetic variants. And I've been through a number of sessions here at this conference. I come every year, and I continuously hear the same story that we have 2,000 variants of this new gene that we discovered many years ago. And I'm like, how do we conquer that next, right? Even just to get beyond that. And then there is Craig Venter's discussion on the whole other end, but I can do the whole genome sequence and the whole exome sequence for less than $500. So I waited for that technology to improve. So one of the trials we're trying to launch in India, and for economical reasons, is we are going to bring in multi-comorbidity conditions into the model. So enough about dealing with single disease pathways. All these patients are highly complex. If you imagine a series of, the Olympic rings model, right? And I give you that example because there's a lot of intersections between those circles. We're not measuring intersections. We're not measuring what happens to these patients. If I throw a pebble in a pool and the lake ripples out, we're not measuring those ripples. We're just measuring, where you threw the pebble in, and that's kind of, known, and we identify a biomarker. We don't measure other states. So we began with a context in mind and the outermost area. Could I measure your context all the time? So our premise is 60 to 70% of your health is driven by your phenotype. And could I take your lifestyle, your behaviors, and begin with your context rather than beginning with your disease? And if I can begin with your context and measure that context and be able to correlate some of these factors, then maybe I don't need that treatment pathway. Maybe the treatment is software. Maybe it's something else. And why to begin that journey? So the million N of one is not just a concept for us. It's actually something we're going to go ahead and deploy in 3 populations with diabetes, COPD, and progression to lung cancer. And we're going to do it with 2 different academic medical centers and with a commercial client to be able to understand what happens in real-world evidence studies rather than a trial-driven, drug trial-driven model. So in order to do that, in order to build our technology, we accumulated, you need data. And so we said, well, what kind of data do we need? And then how do we begin this journey? So we have, initially, as a startup, you have to focus on, what can you do with what you have resource-wise. So we have accumulated EHR, EMR data, 100 million patient records. And we have connected that to about 47,000 patients which came out of ICU stay. Highly complex, highly comorbid populations. And we have used their biosensoring data, so actual biometrics, and can we predict the next event within that clinical setting, whether they're in a hospital system, whether they're in a home, whether they're just walking along their neighborhood. How can I get that data back, which tells me about their clinical state? And then we aggregate that with your continuous exposures, which is where the environment and your context comes in. What are you breathing? How far do you live from the street? What's your demographic like, right? I don't know anything about you. I just know inclusion-exclusion criteria in a clinical trial. So as much real world as we can build into this is our goal. And finally, then, how do we incorporate behaviors and some of the things I talked about, this patient up front. We can, based on our technology, predict in 14 diseases today with anomaly prediction in 2. The anomaly prediction can be done up to an hour ahead, maybe even 5 minutes ahead. So if you can imagine if you're an ICU stay patient, so why do I say this? I say this because our physicians are in short supply. People like Walter and Skip are in short supply. Our nursing staff is in short supply. How do I detect whose event is more important? Who needs priority, right? And so in an ICU setting, for example, number of patients need care. Can we actually divert staff to one place or another? And so here's an example of a patient from our database. And to give you a sense of why I think the world is not uniquely just diabetes issues, diabetes could be 1,000 diseases underneath, much like we have discovered with cancer. So this patient, if you see some of this area highlighted in blue at the top, this is a patient who was in a hospital for 101 days, has 18 comorbidities, was there for 4 stays, totaling 101 days, passed on eventually. If you see below, he was on 220 medications. So tell me anything you've heard at this conference, from genetic variants to all the digital technologies that will help this patient today. We can't. We can't. There's just too many combinations. There are too many permutations, too many treatment pathways. How do you narrow that spectrum? So we took this guy and we took this patient and we said, can I simplify? Can I even attempt to resolve his care pattern? Not everybody is like that, but if I can get to a better result, better health outcomes for this kind of patient, then I can probably get to a 25-year-old who's well and is healthy, right? Because his patterns will be much more sparse, but I need pattern data in order to build the underlying AI to be able to predict what could happen to this patient. So I give you this example because his hepatic encephalopathy was not even detected till his visit 3, and he had cirrhosis of liver in visit 4, and then he died. But he, as you see, he was a diabetic patient. He progressed to COPD. So if I was just measuring diabetes and I was getting great HbA1c outcomes, could I have done different for this patient? And all of you will probably agree, maybe not. Right? And that's the fallacy, what I believe is what the drug industry is living with, that just single-threaded cures work. They don't. Here's another example. We took one of his disease conditions in CHF, and we took the top 50 drugs that were being administered over time, and we can narrow his neighborhood down to the ones that matter. So the top right is some of the drugs that he was prescribed very often. So if you're looking at treatment pathways, this is a real-world evidence of what was working for him and what was not working for him. If you sum this down, why we say 14 diseases, we're growing capabilities to 80 diseases. This is a confusion matrix. It's a probabilistic model of how much can we predict on a certain patient population. So I did this extract, and I'll show you this in a second. But this is about 22,000 patients worth of data I'm summarizing on this screen across those 14 diseases I talk about. There's the other category at the end, which is all the other 80 or 1,000 diseases that I can't, have not worked on yet. But what we are achieving is at the bottom of the screen, if you look down the accuracy piece, we are in the 90s. So we do have some clinical utility for this kind of an AI solution, where we can look at highly comorbid populations, we can look at single comorbid populations, but we begin to assemble the knowledge in a way that gives us a very defined insight on how to approach a disease, looking at disease patterns as a technology. This is the other example I gave you of the ICU stay population. And so the biggest problem you have applying AI to our industry, to healthcare, is our patterns are different. We're all different. And we could all be diabetics, but we're all different diabetics. So what we observe in data is that what worked for me may not necessarily work for you. And how many pharmas know that, right? Real world evidence is very different. So what do we do when things don't work? So for the problem for AI is you have to be able to do transfer learning, what we call transfer learning. What worked for Geisinger's population, which has been in Danville, Pennsylvania for 150 years, and the population is just resident there, it's above 65, they never move, very well defined, no mixing, we can probably do better prediction, versus a city center where you're sitting there, population is always a mix. How do I transfer what I just learned from Geisinger to New York City? Right? Very different problem. So what we have to do from a technology standpoint is make sure that our learnings are transferable. It's called transfer learning. and hence the reasons for working with different populations. I'll show you this piece live. What we are actually doing in the top half is we have taken technology to a couple of parameters where we are now capturing real live data on this complex patient I talked to you about earlier, the one with 101 day stay. And what you're seeing is the first big gap in his data. You see this ascending line, which is where we have no data on him. But then the two parameters you're seeing top left is SpO2. It's actuals. Actuals are in black. Red is predicted. And then you see a blue line, which is sort of indicating the aspect of what's normal for this kind of parameter or population. Second bar is a percentage measure of the same, and you're basically sort of seeing anomaly likelihood. This is calculated over millions of calculations as to where we believe is an anomaly for this parameter for this patient. So precision health. And below that, you see BPM, beats per minute, and you're starting to see the scale is auto scale. It adjusts itself as it sees the data coming in. But what you're starting to, this is predicting 1 hour out what will happen to this patient. So right now, the green bars in all of these, the two anomaly charts, the green bar is a static measure because the system is learning from these patterns. It's looking at these millions of data points and it's learning what this patient's patterns are all about. So this is one of our attempts to see how can we deliver real-time interventions, not something where you go away and you wait. Can we deliver real-time interventions when necessary? Eventually, this patient, what we know from data, he did pass away. But 2 days prior to his passage, we had signals from SpO2, where the SpO2 dropped a little bit. So if you were just watching the actuals, if you're just watching his spirometry or his actuals, you would say he's normal. But our anomaly likelihood scores, having learned all the patterns of this patient, was predicting a higher anomaly likelihood. So if we had this kind of technology available to general populace, to even healthy populace, you don't know when the next event is going to come. And what's the worst that could happen? I'm wrong. That's the worst that could happen. What's the best that could happen? I've saved a life, or I have predicted an event and I've pushed it off. So you go for an extra doctor's visit, right? I mean, that's the worst you're sort of looking at. I'll stop. I'll get out of this because I want to give Skip an opportunity. But just to kind of show you another dimension of this data, and you can see this. These are the same 22,000 patients that we have employed Google machine learning with. And all the blue dots in this display, we took, so this, as I said, this was 1.3 million patients. I extracted the 22,000 for this discussion today. And what we have done is we have mapped them to their multiple comorbid conditions. I can now take, these patients have about several thousand columns that describe their health state. We have distilled them down to about 600 features that you could use the data to actually say, well, how do these 600 features affect these 22,000 patients? From those 600 features, I needed a way to visualize. You always hear AI is a black box. You can't, see what it's doing. FDA needs proof. How can you show me it's going to give me the same result every time? I can't tell you if it's going to be the same result every time because data is real time. Data is going to come in on a real time basis. It's not static. It's not something I ran 5 years ago. It's coming. And if your state of life changes, then it's going to update. So what you see here is essentially a three-dimensional. It takes those 600 dimensions and it crystallizes it down to 3. Each of these dots is actually a patient, a de-identified patient. So these are all the patient numbers. And we can then label now for all the 14 diseases where my distribution is on this population. So I can actually just now see where the patterns of disease are, right? And this could be anything. This could be data, drug data. This could be my procedures in a hospital. This could be, all the interventions we are doing in diabetes. It could be anything, right? Because our data contains all that stuff, right? So this is one way. Now, and the reason for visualization is because we don't understand how to unpack the black box. So we are unpacking it. We're showing you what's inside. But then, now you can actually see all the different trends of different diseases in this population. And so let's assume we decide that, we want to examine a certain trend in this population, and I want to be able to go back and say, I'm very interested in looking at, let's say, this cluster. So I can actually zoom into this particular cluster of patients, and now I can just say, isolate this data. And now I can only visualize that particular, data model. Now, this is happening, as it's working through it. And let's say I want to identify what's with this particular patient. I click on this, and I say, well, show me what's going on, with this patient's state. And I should be able to zoom in here and tell you that this patient has about 14 different comorbidities. So here we go. And now you can see the red dots in context of the whole population here. Here's all my conditional probability distribution of this patient. This patient is about a 20th each or a 15th each in Alzheimer's, chronic heart failure, COPD, diabetes, and osteoporosis. So please tell me which intervention would you go ahead with here? Hard to say just the diabetic one would work, right? Because there's a distribution, there's a complex network of diseases here. So what we have also done is another model which then says, okay, if this was my cohort of patients, can I actually use, can I look at patterns in all your diseases, in all the drugs, and all the procedures you went through, and be able to correlate this data in real time? So what you'll see next is it's basically going to take this model of this cohort, it's going to blow it up, it's going to calculate what's called a medical neighborhood, what the chart I showed you before with the 50 drugs in the shape of a semicircle. And it's going to now blow this up, and it's going to start calculating in real time how these each patients correlate. So if you were looking at patient similarity, or if you're looking for cohort similarity, or patient identification for your drug trials, or looking for drugs with similar mechanism of action, or looking to see where VR would work versus not. This is a highly depressive patient, and he needs some other therapy rather than antidepressants because antidepressants haven't worked for him. We can begin to we can deploy this technology. Just a couple examples of trying to show you how AI is being approached. So to conclude, what I would say is that in order to sort of look at a VR model for us as a startup, what we took an approach was we need the foundation, and we need then to be able to build on a foundation of data, but then also show the FDA there's all this contextual data that's giving me different signals than what the drug signal is telling. And that's highly important for any of the players, payers, providers, pharma, if you can think of that. And then we have to show that that's transferable to different populations. These learnings need to be transferable. And then from that perspective, if you were just walking around your neighborhood and I say, Beth, I'm sensing a 3 standard deviation departure from your past heart rate, which I've measured over the last month. I feel there is a heart event coming. I suggest to go see a physician. Now, if you were an 85-year-old and just got this and don't know where your contact information is, and I know and I see this event is coming, I have your geospatial information, I have your context, I know where you are. Let me redirect you to the nearest facility, or let me actually inform the hospital staff that they should be awaiting you, your arrival, right? And that's where we are taking AI, VR technology. We want to build this virtual assistant model in order to be able to deploy this. So hopefully this sets you up for what I'm going to, bring our presenter next, Chris Chin, who's now going to take you down a journey where a technology company approaching this from a perspective of sort of saying, how do I then take this data and instead of, you know, what I just showed you on a screen like this, can I create room scale experiences where I can actually walk around an eye and I can walk around a brain, and can I actually experience which nerve has to be operated on today, tomorrow? And then also, you know, the reason I told you this story about this patient is you have to look at this from an empathetic perspective of what, you know, this is a real life data, this is what the technology is telling me. Just superimposing a drug model is not suffice. It does not work for all the patients. It's not to say the work we are all doing is unimportant. It's just, I think, we have other modalities that can be brought in to accentuate this technology. Thank you for your time, and I'll introduce Christian from HTC Wild.